My beloved child, something shifted when nobody was expecting it, and the strangest part is that it happened at the exact moment someone else had begun to believe your soulmate was finally leaving you behind. From the outside, everything seemed settled. His silence looked convincing. His distance looked intentional. The third party watched him carry on with ordinary conversations, ordinary routines, ordinary days, and slowly began to believe that whatever connection had once existed between you had finally become nothing more than a memory. But appearances can tell only the easiest part of a story. Somewhere beneath everything he was showing, there remained one quiet place he had never completely emptied of you. He may not have spoken about it. He may even have tried to convince himself that moving forward meant never looking backward. Yet certain connections do not disappear simply because someone stops mentioning them. They become quieter. They settle beneath the noise. And sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected moment to bring everything hidden there back into focus. Don't skip what comes next, because it was not a dramatic confession that changed his direction. It was something far smaller, almost ordinary, and that is exactly why it reached him so deeply. A familiar detail crossed his path. Perhaps it was a place that carried an old memory, a phrase spoken innocently by someone who knew nothing about you, a melody arriving at the wrong, or perhaps strangely right, moment, or even a quiet thought that appeared without invitation. Whatever the trigger was, it interrupted him. For a few seconds, the life directly in front of him became less important than the feeling rising inside him. And suddenly, there you were again, not physically, but emotionally, vividly, unmistakably. The third party noticed the change before understanding its meaning. His attention drifted. His expression softened. Something about him became distant, as though part of his mind had stepped into another room where nobody else could follow. They may have wondered what happened. Why now? Why would someone who seemed ready to move on suddenly become thoughtful again? But they could not see what he was remembering. They could not hear the private questions beginning to form inside him. Did I misunderstand what we had? Did I walk away from something before I truly understood it? Why does this person still come to mind when I thought I had finally made peace with the past? And perhaps the deepest question of all. Why does remembering them still feel different from remembering anyone else? Stay till the end, because this is where the story begins to turn in a way even he did not anticipate. What pulled him back was not simply nostalgia. Nostalgia can make almost any memory glow for a moment. This felt more specific. He began remembering the parts of you that were easy to overlook while everything was happening. The way you understood certain silences without demanding explanations, the small details you remembered, the calmness of moments that once seemed ordinary, and perhaps even the version of himself that appeared naturally around you. Sometimes people do not recognize the value of a connection while they are standing inside it. Distance changes the angle. Silence removes distractions. Time reveals contrasts. And somewhere inside that contrast, he started seeing something he had not been ready to see before. The third party had believed your absence meant the story was finished, but your absence was quietly teaching him what your presence had meant. That realization did not arrive loudly. It came in fragments. A conversation with someone else that somehow reminded him of how differently you listened. A moment he wanted to share, followed immediately by the realization that you were still the person who came to mind. A memory that should have felt old, yet carried surprising warmth. Each small moment seemed insignificant by itself, but together they were creating a pattern he could no longer easily dismiss. Something important is waiting for you here, because the unexpected pull was not asking him to repeat the past. It was forcing him to look at it differently. There is a powerful difference between missing someone because you feel lonely and remembering someone because time has finally clarified what they represented. He began wondering whether what he had called moving on was actually just becoming skilled at avoiding certain feelings. That question stayed with him longer than he expected. And the more he tried to return to normal, the more another realization quietly followed him: you had never needed to chase his attention to remain meaningful. You had simply left an impression strong enough to survive distance. Even so, this does not mean every memory must become a reunion, or every feeling must become a promise. What matters is what happened inside him next. Instead of immediately acting, he began paying attention. He noticed when thoughts of you appeared. He noticed what caused them. He noticed that they were not always connected to loneliness or regret. Sometimes they appeared when he was perfectly fine, surrounded by people, occupied with life, and that made them harder to explain away. Then came the moment the third party could not ignore. Something about him changed again, but this time it was not temporary. A new curiosity entered his silence. He wanted to know something about you. Not everything. Not yet. Just enough to answer a question he had been carrying privately: had you changed too? Had life taken you somewhere completely different? Were you happier now? And perhaps, somewhere beneath those questions, was another one he was almost afraid to admit to himself, not from fear, but because answering it could change the meaning of everything that had happened between you. What if the connection he thought he had outgrown had actually been waiting for both of you to grow enough to understand it? For the first time, the third party sensed that his distance from you was no longer simple. They had thought the door had quietly closed. But now he was standing somewhere inside himself, looking back toward it, remembering something nobody else had been able to replace in quite the same way. And just when he thought this was only another passing memory, one more unexpected detail appeared, something connected directly to you, something he could not easily dismiss as coincidence or nostalgia. He stopped. He looked again. And what he discovered in that moment was about to make him question why you had returned to his thoughts now, after all this time. What appeared in front of him seemed almost too ordinary to matter, yet for reasons he could not immediately explain, he could not move past it. It was a small reminder connected to you, the kind of detail another person might have overlooked completely, but something inside him recognized it before his mind had time to create an explanation. And suddenly the question was no longer simply, why am I thinking about them again? It became something deeper: why does this still mean so much to me? He stayed with that thought longer than he intended. The third party could sense his attention shifting, although they could not see the memories unfolding behind his silence. They had assumed that enough time, enough distance, and enough new experiences would eventually make you feel irrelevant to him. For a while, even he may have believed that. Yet this unexpected reminder revealed something neither of them had considered. Moving forward had changed him, but it had also given him enough distance to recognize things about your connection that were difficult to see while he was living inside it. He remembered conversations that once seemed simple but now felt unusually sincere. He remembered moments when you noticed changes in his mood before he ever explained them. He remembered how certain silences between you never felt empty. And then came a realization that unsettled the comfortable story he had been telling himself. Perhaps what he missed was not merely you as a person, but the rare feeling of being understood without constantly having to perform or explain himself. Don't skip this, because the next part of his realization was even more revealing. He started comparing, not deliberately, not unfairly, but naturally. A conversation would happen, and afterward he would remember how differently a similar conversation felt with you. Someone would laugh at something he said, and unexpectedly he would remember the particular way you understood his humor. He would experience a small victory, and for one brief second his instinct would be to imagine telling you. These were tiny moments, almost invisible from the outside, yet they were quietly exposing something enormous inside him. Your absence had created a contrast. And contrast has a strange way of revealing value. The third party had believed your silence meant their position had become secure, but they could not compete with something they could not see, memory becoming clarity. This was not about one person being better than another. It was about him recognizing that certain connections carry their own emotional language, and the language he once shared with you had never been completely forgotten. Then something even more unexpected happened. Instead of pushing the thoughts away, he allowed himself to follow one. Just one. He wondered where you were emotionally now. He wondered whether you still carried any warmth toward what the two of you once shared, or whether you had peacefully stepped into a completely different chapter. Strangely, the possibility that you might genuinely be moving forward without him created a feeling he had not prepared for. Not possession. Not entitlement. Something quieter. The realization that while he had been assuming there would always be more time to understand his feelings, your life had continued moving too. Stay till the end, because that realization changed the direction of his thoughts. For perhaps the first time, he stopped asking whether you still cared about him and started asking whether he had ever truly shown you how much he cared. That distinction mattered. Memories began returning from a different angle. He remembered moments when you might have needed clarity and received hesitation instead. Times when something sincere could have been said, but pride, uncertainty, timing, or simple emotional confusion kept the words hidden. He did not suddenly rewrite the past into something perfect. He remembered the difficult moments too. But now he could see that imperfection did not necessarily erase meaning. Sometimes two people can matter deeply to each other and still meet during a season when neither knows exactly what to do with that connection. And that possibility stayed with him. The third party noticed that he had become quieter whenever certain subjects came up. Your name did not even need to be spoken. Sometimes a familiar place was enough. Sometimes an old reference. Sometimes nothing obvious at all. They had expected your memory to become smaller with time, but instead it seemed to be changing shape, from something he avoided into something he wanted to understand. And then, without announcing it to anyone, he did something small. He searched for a trace of you. Perhaps he looked at something connected to your life, revisited an old memory, or simply allowed himself to wonder what you might be doing now. There was no dramatic plan behind it. He was not promising himself a reunion. He was searching for information because curiosity had finally become stronger than avoidance. But what he found did not give him the easy reassurance he expected. He saw evidence, however small, that you had continued becoming someone beyond the version of you he remembered. There was a different energy around you now. A sense that life had been shaping you too. And strangely, instead of making him feel more distant, it pulled his attention closer. Because suddenly he understood that if your paths ever crossed again, he would not be meeting the exact person he once knew. He would be meeting someone who had lived, learned, healed from disappointments, discovered new strengths, and perhaps become more careful about where they placed their heart. Something important is waiting for you here. He realized he could not simply return expecting everything to be where he left it. If he ever stepped toward you again, he would have to arrive differently. With greater honesty, greater maturity, greater respect for whatever boundaries and choices now belong to you. And that realization changed the emotional weight of everything. Until now, thinking about you had been private and safe. He could remember without risking anything. But eventually every meaningful realization creates a question about action. Would he remain silent and let this understanding become another lesson he carried alone? Or would he find a thoughtful way to discover whether there was still something worth exploring between you? The third party could sense that something had changed, yet even they did not know how close he was becoming to an answer. Because later, in one unexpectedly quiet moment, he remembered something you had once said, words he barely understood when you first spoke them. This time, they landed differently. He replayed them once. Then again. And suddenly he understood why those words had returned to him now. They contained a truth about your connection he had completely missed the first time, and once he recognized it, staying emotionally distant became much harder than he expected. The words returned without warning, almost as though his memory had been waiting for the exact moment when he was finally mature enough to understand them. Back then, when you first said them, they may have sounded simple, perhaps something about timing, honesty, choosing what feels peaceful rather than what merely looks right, or the quiet truth that genuine connection should never require someone to abandon who they are. He heard you then, but he did not fully understand you. Now he did. And that difference changed something inside him. Suddenly, moments he had filed away as ordinary began rearranging themselves into a completely different picture. He remembered how you rarely demanded certainty from him, yet somehow your presence made him think more deeply about what he truly wanted. He remembered that you did not need every silence filled. You could simply be there. And perhaps most unexpectedly, he realized that some of the qualities he had been searching for elsewhere were qualities he had already experienced with you without knowing how rare they were. That realization did not make him rush toward you. It made him still. Because sometimes the strongest emotional shift is not the moment someone acts, it is the moment they can no longer comfortably believe the story they used to tell themselves. He had told himself that distance meant closure. He had assumed that because days passed without contact, the connection must have naturally become smaller. But now another possibility was quietly emerging. Maybe distance had not erased what mattered. Maybe it had removed enough noise for him to finally see it clearly. Don't skip this, because what happened next was not something the third party had prepared for. They had been watching the surface. They saw routines continue. They saw your soulmate participating in life. They may even have interpreted his silence about you as proof that your chapter had ended. Yet underneath that surface, he had started revisiting questions he once avoided. Not questions about whether the past could simply be recreated, but whether he had misunderstood what the past was trying to teach him. There is a difference. He did not want to return to an old version of the connection. Something in him was beginning to wonder whether there could ever be a new version. One built with clearer intentions, calmer communication, and two people who had learned from the space between them. Then came another unexpected shift. He started remembering you without immediately remembering the complications. At first, that surprised him. For so long, his mind had connected your memory with unanswered questions, difficult timing, or everything that never quite became clear. But now those details were losing their power. What remained were smaller things. Your expression when something genuinely made you happy. The way certain conversations seemed to stretch beyond time. The strange familiarity he sometimes felt around you. The moments when he could sense that you understood more than he had actually said. And somewhere inside those memories, he recognized something that made him quietly uncomfortable. Perhaps he had mistaken emotional depth for emotional difficulty simply because depth required him to become more honest with himself. Stay till the end, because this is where his attention moved from memory toward possibility. He began wondering what a conversation with you would sound like now. Would there be awkwardness? Warmth? Distance? Would you recognize the changes in him? Would he recognize the changes in you? He imagined hearing your voice after all that silence, and something about the thought felt strangely grounding. Yet he also understood something important. He had no right to assume that you had been waiting. Your life belonged to you. Your growth belonged to you. Whatever feelings you carried now were yours to choose. That realization did not weaken what he felt. It made it more respectful. If he ever approached you again, he knew it could not be with expectations. It would have to begin with sincerity. Perhaps simply, "How have you been?" Nothing dramatic. Nothing designed to force an outcome. Just one honest doorway opened carefully enough that you could decide whether you wanted to step toward it too. And this was precisely what the third party had not expected. They thought pulling away from you would eventually make him forget. Instead, the distance was teaching him not to take emotional connection for granted. They thought new experiences would automatically replace old feelings. Instead, those experiences gave him something to compare. Not people against people, but depth against convenience, understanding against assumption, authenticity against appearances. Something important is waiting for you here, because the more he understood this, the less interested he became in pretending that you never mattered. He did not need to announce it. He did not need to make a dramatic declaration. He simply stopped arguing with himself about what he felt. And there is a quiet power in that moment. The moment a person stops running from an emotion and starts examining what it is actually trying to reveal. He asked himself why your memory returned during peaceful moments rather than only lonely ones. Why certain accomplishments still made him wonder what you would say. Why becoming more emotionally aware somehow made him understand you better instead of forgetting you. And the answer that slowly formed was surprisingly simple. Perhaps you had become connected in his mind not only with romance, but with recognition. With being seen. With a version of himself that felt genuine. That was why the pull felt different. But then something happened that took this private realization and brought it dangerously close to the real world. He encountered a detail about you he had not known before. Nothing alarming. Nothing dramatic. Yet it suggested that a meaningful change had happened in your life while he had been away. For the first time, he understood that time was not standing still for either of you. The opportunity to speak someday was not the same as choosing to speak now. He stared at what he had discovered, wondering whether reaching out would bring clarity or simply disturb the peace you had created. For several moments, he did nothing. Then his hand moved almost instinctively toward the one place where a conversation with you could begin. He stopped before completing the action. Read the words he had started forming. Erased them. Tried again. And what he finally considered saying was nothing like the message he would have sent months earlier, because this time he was not trying to pull you backward into the past. He was preparing to acknowledge something far more meaningful about the present, and the third party had no idea how close he was to finally letting you know. For several seconds, his unfinished message remained there, glowing quietly on the screen, and the strange thing was that the hardest part was no longer deciding whether he still cared, it was deciding what kind of honesty you deserved from him now. He could have written something casual and pretended the distance between you had meant nothing. He could have hidden behind a simple greeting, hoping you would somehow understand everything he was too hesitant to say. But something inside him resisted that. Too much had changed. You had changed. He had changed. And if this connection was ever going to be approached again, even gently, he sensed that it could not begin with the same uncertainty that had once created distance between you. So he erased another sentence. Then another. Not because he wanted perfect words, but because for the first time he was thinking about how those words might feel from your side. What would it be like to hear from someone after you had finally learned how to live without expecting them? What would it be like if that person suddenly returned carrying feelings they had never clearly expressed before? That question slowed him down, and strangely, slowing down brought him closer to the truth. He realized that reaching toward you could not be about relieving his own curiosity. It had to respect whatever chapter you were living now. Don't skip this moment, because the unexpected pull that brought him back was beginning to transform into something much more meaningful than missing you. It was becoming accountability. He started recognizing the difference between wanting access to someone and wanting to understand them. Between returning because the present feels empty and returning because distance has revealed something worth honoring. And when he examined himself carefully, he discovered that what kept drawing him toward you was not an urge to possess the past. It was the quiet awareness that there were things left unsaid, things that perhaps deserved to be acknowledged even if nothing else followed. That realization surprised him. Maybe he wanted you to know that your presence had mattered. Maybe he wanted to admit that some of your words had stayed with him longer than he ever told you. Maybe he wanted to say that time had shown him certain qualities in you that familiarity once caused him to overlook. Yet another thought stopped him just before he could move forward. What if you no longer needed to hear any of it? That possibility was difficult, but he did not turn away from it. Instead, he allowed it to teach him something. Real care sometimes means accepting that another person gets to decide whether a door remains open. And strangely, accepting that made his feelings clearer rather than weaker. The third party could not understand what was happening beneath his calm exterior. They had believed that if he ever thought about you again, it would be temporary, a passing memory, a brief wave of nostalgia, something easily replaced by the next distraction. But this was different. Every attempt to dismiss you seemed to lead him toward another realization. Every comparison reminded him that what he shared with you had possessed its own texture. Every quiet evening gave him room to hear questions that busy days had buried. And then one question rose above all the others: if I never speak honestly, will I always wonder what might have happened if I had? Stay till the end, because he did not answer that question immediately. Instead, something softer happened. He remembered one particular moment between you that he had almost forgotten. It was not necessarily romantic. Perhaps nobody else would have considered it important. But in that memory, you had seen him during an ordinary, unguarded moment, and instead of asking him to become more impressive, more certain, or more polished, you simply met him where he was. He remembered the ease of it. The lack of performance. And suddenly he understood why thoughts of you kept returning whenever his life became quiet. You represented something that could not easily be manufactured. Emotional familiarity without constant explanation. That did not mean the past had been perfect. It did not guarantee what the future should become. But it explained why forgetting had never been as simple as he wanted it to be. Something important is waiting for you, because while he was remembering that moment, another realization entered his mind, one that shifted the story away from what he wanted and toward what you deserved. If he came back into your life, he could not ask you to trust words alone. He would need to show consistency. He would need to listen instead of assuming. He would need to understand that whatever connection remained would have to grow naturally, without pressure, without demanding that you become the person you used to be. And for the first time, he imagined not a dramatic reunion, but something much quieter. Two changed people having one sincere conversation and allowing the truth of that conversation to determine what happened next. That image stayed with him. It felt calmer than fantasy. More mature than longing. More real. The third party noticed the difference too. They could sense that this was no longer merely a memory passing through him. Something had settled into his attention. He was not distracted by you anymore, he was considering you. There was intention behind his silence now. Yet nobody around him knew the most surprising part. The message he had been writing was still unsent. He had stopped because one final question needed an answer before he crossed that line. Was he reaching toward you because he wanted something from you, or because he finally had something honest to give? He sat with that question until the answer became uncomfortable in the best possible way. He realized that before asking anything about your feelings, he needed to acknowledge his own choices. No excuses. No rewriting history. No pretending timing had been solely responsible for everything. He needed to recognize the places where hesitation had spoken louder than affection. And then, almost unexpectedly, the words became simple. The complicated sentences disappeared. The explanations became unnecessary. What remained was a message built around respect, honesty, and one small opening for conversation. His finger hovered again. This time, he did not immediately erase it. But just before he decided whether to send it, something happened on your side of the story, something he had no way of predicting. A tiny sign appeared where he least expected one. It did not tell him what you felt, and it certainly did not promise what would happen next. But it answered one question he had been carrying for longer than he realized.